Dear participants in live presence and in online presence, whoever enters the conclave as Pope emerges from it as a cardinal. This popular saying for papal elections has proven surprisingly often. However, May 8th stands out when the white smoke rose after the fourth round of voting on the evening of that day. Most commentators agreed. If the cardinals agreed so quickly, then only one could be the new Pope, Pietro Parolin, who was considered the top favorite. Let's just have a look on the betting market. Here, you see the betting market with the odds of Parolin and of Tagle and of Turkson in the last days before the conclave. So Parolin was the clear favorite, and also in the press, all said odds are almost certain Parolin will be the new Pope. But as we know, he didn't. On this point, we learned you should never bet against the Holy Spirit. The fact that the white smoke, also in this year, causes the tensions to rise to the boiling point as to who is chosen is not surprising itself, but it is the result of election regulations. And therefore, this lecture will be about election regulations. It is a prime example of how a cleverly designed legal fixation or institutionalization that has proven itself over centuries can optimize an election. Optimize, that is, with fast, positively surprising results, as we have seen, that promise broad acceptance, also in this year, broad acceptance of Pope Leo. In fact, if we look at the popes of the 20th century alone, it is a miracle how different their personalities were, as different as they were impressive, and how they succeeded despite all massive upheavals and dangers in uniting the church and at the same time advancing it. I would like to show that the church thus has one of the most effective electoral regulations in a worldwide political comparison. At the same time, the conclave order also embodies the values of the church: unanimity and balance of communion and strong individual personality, and despite all human considerations, ultimately the bond to the guidance of the Holy Spirit. In short, the conclave is a prime example of the fact that it is not law against charism, but charism through legal order. Therefore, the election process of the conclave will be presented in 4 points. Let me see, that was, so here it is, 4 points. First, the principles of the election. Second point, the factors of the election that influence the process of the conclave. Third, the typical election processes. We will look at some examples of the 19th and 20th century. And at the end, some challenges of today's papal elections. In this case, I will make a choice of different points. When I wrote this article, this lecture, it was still before the election, before the death of Pope Francis. And so I thought, oh, that's actual, I can make some contribution to the next conclave, but we hope that the next conclave will be within decades. So I will only make a few chosen points in this 4th and last point. So let's start with the first point, which is principles of the election. So, first of all, 11 important principles of the election that make it unique and stand out from most political personal decisions. These principles are deeply rooted in the theological self-understanding of the church, the papacy, and the task of the cardinals. The first and most important principle is unanimity. It is certainly the oldest and most important principles of all church personalities, also the election of a bishop. But in the old church, the ancient church, it was so that the ideal was that there is one supreme shepherd to be elected unanimously by clergy and people. Alberto Meloni has told us that. However, this unanimity is established. There's some historical variety. And this expresses the value or the conviction of being the people of God united by the Holy Spirit in Christ, one heart and one soul. But how to implement this idea of unanimity, as we have seen in the lecture of Alberto Meloni, by and by, there was the idea that a 2/3 majority or qualified majority can implement this ideal in face of factual dissensus in the church, of personal and interest conflicts, or also spheres of influence. Of course, that's normal for the church. But how can you realize the ideal of unanimity in face of all those dissensus? That's the challenge of the 2/3 majority. I'll give you a small example from game theory. In game theory, you see that a qualified majority is a good prevention. If you have for instance, three good candidates, but the three candidates can block each other by being superior to the others in a certain specific point. For instance, if you are a cardinal and you have to elect a pope, and you say, the first cardinal is of my nation, and I like him because he speaks my language. And the second one, he is my favorite because of my church policy. He is also as conservative as I'm. And the third one, he's very impressive because he has a huge pastoral charisma. And in a normal absolute majority process, that can be blocking, because at the end, you will not have an absolute majority. And game theory can show that in a 2/3 majority, you have to make a compromise. And at the end, you will find a candidate. And that's a good point, that indeed the invention of the 2/3 majority was a big, huge step towards bringing the church together and maintaining the papacy as a ministry of unity and not of division. The third point is also a very important value of the church. The church says we are guided by the Holy Spirit. And so the election is, as Alberto Meloni has said, more exactly a designation made by a kind of communal spiritual discernimento. Today, Conclave's order is very much like a spiritual retreat with prayers, or with preaching, sometimes a little long preaching, like on the first day of this conclave. But most prominently, in the act of electing, the single cardinal has to give another oath, and I translated by myself in English. He has to say, I call Christ, who will be my judge. 16 with the judgment, it's very real. I call Christ, who will be my judge, as a witness that I have chosen him who I believe should be chosen according to God's will. That's the point. Designation of the one chosen by God, chosen by the Holy Spirit. For this reason, earlier times also counted on direct intervention from God and provided for the election per inspirationem. However, this form of election was all too often instrumentalized in the so-called adoration or homage election, with which cardinals determined to do everything without any scruple, often simulated a broad consensus for a candidate in a literal knight and fork action. Sometimes they did it after midnight and they awoke some friends and they staged some kind of adoration. And they surprised the other voters and, if necessary, massively urged them to participate in the adoration. And so we can be happy that this a kind of fake adoration and fake will of God and inspiration has been abolished. The next point, the fourth point, the qualification as a voter is on the basis of membership in the College of Cardinals. Since Paul VI, however, with the restriction of the age limit of 80 years. And so you are elector of the next Pope on the basis of a free papal appointment. The fifth point, the equal vote. The vote of every cardinal is equal. That was not always the case. In Middle Ages, there was also the idea, not only in the papal elections, also especially in the religious order of the election of an abbot or prior, that the votes have to be weighted, which means there should be not only the major pass, the majority, but also the senior pass, the people most spiritual, with the highest personal authority, which meant in this case that cardinal bishops, the 6 cardinal bishops, had preference. They could bring forward a name who should be elected. This has also been abolished, so it's really an equal vote. But maybe the principle of weighting the votes is a little transformed. Also today, we have some kind of pope makers. It would be interesting to know who was the pope maker or the pope makers in this year. Because of course, if you have a large membership of cardinal electors, you have to organize that. And so, of course, some focal cardinals will be very important. And so, principle, the equal vote is not at all equal. Next point. In difference to most political personal decisions, the election of the Pope is a lifetime election. So there will be no periodic re-election. It is an election for life. This means that the balance of power between the College of Cardinals and the Pope is only with the College until the acceptance of the elections, and changes from that moment on. From that moment on, the Pope has the plena potestas, and the cardinals are consulting board, but nothing more. The next point, in difference to the ancient church, Meloni has told us that in ancient times the Pope could design his successor, often the archdeacon, who was some kind of a vicar general of the Diocese of Rome. But today that's not more possible, and not even in a moral sense. The Pope cannot say towards the end of his lifetime, oh, this cardinal, he's very holy and he's very practical and he is very good and I like him very much. I like him more than other ones. Of course, he can do that, but morally speaking, that would be not nice, and no Pope in open public will do that. And I think that's good, because knowing that the Pope has such a massive power in the church, the re-election is also some kind of recalibration of the power of the ideas and the directions of the church. And so I think it's good that in this moment the College of Cardinal Electors has the full power. Next point, if we look in history, there were, especially in Middle Ages, some kind of capitulations. What is a capitulation? It was binding electoral promises to the entire college or in return for the vote for a particular candidate. But in worst case, this created a vote by some kind, maybe even of simony. Often the promises were to funds or to certain offices. But in best case, this system of capitulation succeeded in involving significant voter groups and interests, increasing the acceptance of the elected. But today, this is no more viable. At the end, we will speak a little about possible renewal of the capitulation system. Next point. In difference to normal political decisions, we have no formal nomination of candidates as well as of electoral groupings as parties, nations, continents, or interest groups, for instance, the Curia versus the global church. That's interesting. Even the cardinals who are informally, not formally, but informally treated as papabili are no candidates in the formal sense. The factual diversity, the competition of views and interests, the growing tension between the Curia and the Universal Church, especially in modern times, at not least different nationalities, would in themselves call for such kind of formalization or institutionalization of candidacy. For example, in the sense of building blocs and parties, the conservatives, the liberals, the reformers, and so on. It would call for formal consensus building procedures, formations of voter blocks and coalitions. But nevertheless, the status quo with no formal candidates and blocks has the immense advantage that there is no victory or defeat in the formal sense. And compromises or even the flow of votes, for instance, to a compromise candidate, are facilitated. However, look in the future, the more conflictual and fundamental this diversity becomes, the more influential, non-transparent, less domesticable forces, such as pope makers, gray eminences, or even demagogues can become. We have to keep that in mind. Nevertheless, the last 2 points also contribute to the advantage mentioned of no appointing formal candidates. The last 2 points. There is the renunciation and sometimes during the lifetime of a reigning pope, even a ban on election discussions in election campaigns. There should be not the lame duck idea that towards the end of a papacy, maybe the last 1, 2, 3 years, there is open electoral campaign. This would be disastrous for the church. The last point, Meloni has told them some nice stories about the beginning of the conclave, the secrecy of the electoral process. Of course, that's a very important principle of the electoral factor. Also the secrecy, today also a secrecy in perpetuum. After the conclave, the cardinals are not free to tell some nice stories from the conclave. What is the function of this secrecy? I think it's a fourfold function. First, to ensure a free decision of conscience without worrying about later publication. Second, to ward off influence from outside. Third, to facilitate the integration of losers. And fourth, to increase the legitimacy of the elected person on the basis of a displayed consensus. For this reason, in the long term, also stricter rule for the secrecy of the transcript of the election process. Some historians don't like that, but I think it's good that not after, for instance, 20 years, you can make public all the details of the conclave. So this was our first step, 11 very important principles of this election. Second point, factors of the election. In this case, we go from here to here and then from here to here. So we have altogether 8 factors of the election. We ask, how did the papal elections of the past centuries go de facto? What factors are decisive? Unfortunately, there is no reliable contemporary study on this. Of course, secrecy puts a stop to it. However, strict secrecy in perpetuum was only formulated strictly by Pius X, some 120 years ago, so that we are largely dependent on indiscretions and insinuations in the elections of the 20th century. For the 19th century, for instance, it's different. We have some very reliable sources for that. And so we will see, for instance, the election of Pope Leo XIII in another slide. But let's first look on some essential factors of the election. The first, and maybe even the most important factor, is the time factor, which means a quick conclusion is preferred, especially today. All the press, all the media is speculating how long will it last. And today we speak of 1 day, of 2 days, of 3 days, and not of a month or even maybe years. But the time factor for the electors themselves is not the same. It means that the willingness of individuals to agree after a certain period of time to candidates who are actually less in their favor, just to end the conclave, is significantly different. In earlier times, the deprivations of sparse rooms without ventilation, overheated in summer, and the diet rations after a few days also allowed this factor to grow physically. It's very interesting. In former times, Meloni has told us that the election process was like a summer camp for all cardinals. They had to sleep in very small rooms, and they had a very poor diet and so on. But of course, it was to strengthen the time factor, because they knew sometimes the cardinals have much time, and after months they have not chosen, and so they had to put some pressure on that. Today in Santa Marta, they live rather well, and I think also the meals are good Italian food. So it's not more this kind of time factor, but we have another time factor, which is surely as effective as a small diet, because the external expectations of public opinion are a long conclave is considered a sign of a quarrelsome, indecisive college, and they legitimizes the elected as a compromise candidate. And we see this is even more likely to control the time factor. Let's just have a small look on that. Here you have a plot beginning with 500 years ago, and you see it was very different. It's the duration in time, days. But what is very surprising, it is at the end, in the last 150 years, the conclaves have been shortened very much, only 2 up to 5 days, but not more. So today, the time factor is very, very strong. So let's go to the next point. National, continental, or cultural affiliation in a global church. Of course, it is reinforced by the usually greater personal familiarity of cardinals of one's own country or at least continent or their bishops' conference, then by language groups, and certainly also by the socio-economic situation. So there is an informal group building, for instance, of the Global South after the many designations of cardinals coming from the Global South. It is a very important group in the electorate, and you cannot elect a pope without the consent of the Global South. The next point, of course, much discussed in the press and also in internal Catholic circles, there are divisions in theology and ecclesiastical political direction or position. But this factor undoubtedly plays an increasing role and is also reinforced by the fact that it stands out prominently in the public perception. The position is often reduced, however, to a few high-profile statements and behaviors, for example, on gender or life protection issues. For instance, if you look, especially in the US-American websites on cardinals, Cardinal Watch, and so on, it's often only very few very high-profile points they evaluate. Next point, the core spirit. What is the core spirit? Here we have to think, for instance, to the fact that some cardinals belong to the Curia and others to the global church. Such a core spirit holds together to the extent that outsiders summarize the Curia to some value judgment. On the other hand, the close familiarity of years of work on Vatican dicasteries is, of course, also a source of rivalries and power struggles. However, the spirit of the core may also be assumed in the case of membership to certain religious orders, sometimes also to religious orders as such in general, as well as in certain tasks and challenges. For instance, archbishops of large dioceses form a core, theology professors, we have only a few among the cardinals, bishops in a religious denominational diaspora, like the Scandinavian bishops. Perhaps one can also add the status of a special friend and confidant of the Pope, especially if the appointment was obviously mainly determined by this friendship. This is the next point, our fifth point here. A special closeness to one of the past popes, especially the last pope. A certain indicator of this is, on the one hand, the fact that he has been elevated to cardinal by a certain pope. On the other hand, special personal awards, for instance, as a retreat preacher in the Vatican, and much more. Alberto Meloni has already told us that today many cardinals electors are appointed by the last pope. Let's just have a look on the statistics. First, the core spirit. You see the Curia effect. The Curia is this one. Is not so strong because most of the cardinals come from the global church. And if you consider that the Curia itself is divided in some rivalries, today the Curia is not more a very decisive block in the electoral process. Now let's see how many years, this is the number of years, how long are they cardinals? And you see that we have quite a lot of cardinals being cardinal only 1 to 2, 3 to 5, or 6 to 8 years. So many cardinals are still, let's call them a little freshmen. They are not already very much integrated in the Senate in the College of the Cardinals. I think I have, yeah. And here, the closeness to a certain pope, if you have a look, who has appointed the cardinals, the living cardinals today, you see John Paul II, Benedict, Ratzinger, and Francis. And the blue ones are the electors, and the red or beige ones are the cardinals as such. And of course, you see surviving cardinals. No, what was that? Jetzt müssen Sie mir helfen. Das ist irgendwie rausgesprungen. I wanted to say that the cardinals created by Pope Francis, especially the cardinals in the electoral age, okay, thank you very much, are mostly from Pope Francis. It's almost 80% of the electors of May 8th who have been appointed by Pope Francis. This is a point which is very much stressed by the age limit. Because of the age limit, the reigning Pope has a very huge power to form and transform the electoral college of the cardinals. I don't comment on that, but it's a point we have to keep in mind. So, we go back to the next point, the dependencies of financial and non-material nature. Which means also in this year, of course, the huge deficit of the Vatican is also a question to be considered, especially considering that the major donors to the Vatican comes from the United States and in another sense also from Germany. So I'm sure that the cardinals also considered the question of how to, let's call it, please the American donors. And I think they have done a good job. Okay. Of course, that you will not find in the press and you will not find that in the Vatican media and so on. But the mammon is also a question you have to consider. It's not legitimate. The next point, of course, the ideas of a certain candidate of the course to be taken by the church and its priorities. You know, in the pre-conclave, there are many speeches. I think this time it was 150 speeches of cardinals speaking to the status ecclesiae. But of course, they did not simply speak about the church, but they presented also themselves. It's recorded that the speech of Bergoglio 12 years ago was so overwhelming that this was very decisive for his election. We cannot prove that, but it's a saying. And of course, an election always takes place essentially against the background of the expectations of the elected, and these expectations are not only determined individually, but they are also exposed to moods, evaluations of the past pontificate, and last but not least, the evaluations in the leading media. So if you have a current of change, a wind of change, you will decide for another candidate. Then, for instance, if the dominant idea is that you have to have some continuity, restoring of order, and being a little more balanced. Of course, it's very decisive for the election. Last point, there's also a common culture. So not only core spirit of the Curia cardinals, but a common culture of behavior of all the cardinals during a conclave, combined also with a common interest. For instance, the common interest is to be presented as a very decisive Senate of the Church. So the time factor is also dominated by this common culture. Once we can present Pope after 24 hours, we are great. We are masters of the election. And we can say this year they have done a wonderful job. They have proved very effective, very well. And if you have watched the faces of the cardinals at the loggia in the moment when the new Pope was presented, they laughed like schoolboys. And they knew we have a big surprise for you all, but this surprise will be a very pleasant surprise for you all. Please give us some applause. That's the common culture, and that's good. Another point of the common culture, for instance, is that the elected will not say, oh, I'm very pleased, you have just chosen the best man. But there is a culture of saying no, culture of saying, oh, I'm not dignified for that. In history, we have many examples, for instance, also Pius X, that they seriously declined the election. And of course, it's part of the common culture that other cardinals will say to them, well, just do it, we will pray for you, we will stand on your side, and so on. And then at the end, he says, okay, if it's the will of God, I will do that. Famous newer example is Cardinal Ratzinger. He told us when the election was very close to the point that he was elected, he was saying it was like a sword on my head about to fall. But then Cardinal Meissner from Cologne went to him and he encouraged him and said, you have to do that, and we will be with you, and it's wonderful. And at the end, he did it. Of course, it's also staging. That's part of common culture. We don't know what really in the heart of Ratzinger was in this moment. I personally think he was not very much pleased, but he accepted just by obedience. Okay, those are 8 factors of the election. And we see it's a very interesting and very complex process. Now, let's have a look on history, some typical electoral processes. How does conclave work in praxis? And if we can make some typology, of course it's a very rough typology, we can say there are 4 typical electoral processes. The first is a single candidate begins with the undisputed favorite, begins as the undisputed favorite with a high number of votes already in the first ballot, which he continuously increases. After that, I will show you an example. The second type is the election quickly comes to a head with 2 promising candidates who embody different currents or political approaches, one of whom ultimately wins the race. The third, the compromise candidate, cardinal who was initially little noticed, rises to become a compromise candidate. And the fourth type, a wide field of very different candidates is sorted only gradually and as a result of complicated negotiations. Now let us have a look on some aspects, also statistical aspects of that, of these 4 types. The first is, in this plot, you see the number of cardinals, that's the blue. Who are here? You see, for instance, we are starting with the election of Leo XIII in 1878. There were 61 cardinals, and at a long time it was more or less on this level. And then it starts to raise with the election of Paul VI. It was already 80 cardinals, and today we had 133. The red line, one, is the number of ballots. And you see it's a little changing, but normally it's about 5 or 4 ballots only, especially in the last 60 years. You see here 5, 4. Then for John Paul II, even 8 ballots was rather long because he was a compromise candidate. But then for Ratzinger, only 4, Bergoglio 5, and Leo Prevost only 4 ballots. So it's a very effective kind of electoral process. Now let's have a look on the election of Pope Leo, but not Leo XIV, but the 13th in 1878. He was the first type, rasch wachsender Spitzenkandidat, which means a person who just in the first ballot had already the most of the votes, and then he increases. Reading this ballot is rather simple. Those are the ballots: the first, second, the third, and the fourth. He also was elected in the fourth ballot. And you see the number of votes. There were 60 cardinals. That's the number of cardinals, all. And you see in the first ballot, there were a lot of other names. That's usual. That's also part of the common culture. In the first ballot, you simply make some joke. You have a friend and you say, "Oh, I vote for him." Only in the second ballot it will be more serious. But already in the first ballot, you had 19. Almost a third of the ballots for the future Pope. And that was very promising. And it increases from ballot to ballot, 19, 26, 34, and at the end, 44. So that's the first type. That's the easiest type, if you want. So, but the next type, Pius X. It was that famous conclave in 1903, where, as Meloni has pointed out, there has for the last time has been the exclusiva, which means the intervention of Austria to block the candidacy of Rampolla. But now let us see what happened at that time. Rampolla is the second one, the green one. And indeed, you see Rampolla in the first ballot, again, it's the first and it's the last ballot. The first ballot, the green one, he was rather promising with 24 votes. And then came the second ballot. He was even more promising with 29 ballots. And then came the exclusiva. And we know that the cardinals were very much displeased with the exclusiva. And there was very much opposition to that intervention of Austria. And so we could expect that in reaction to the exclusiva, which they denied, Rampolla would have won. But it's a very interesting point that Rampolla probably already in the second ballot has exhausted his possibilities. And so you see in the next ballot here, we have 29 again. So he hasn't won by the exclusiva and by the opposition and by the excitement. And that was very important because in this moment, in the third ballot, there is one candidate who at the beginning was only one among many, and it was Giuseppe Sato, the future Pope. And you see, only there, he wins more and more, and at the end he had a huge win of votes, 50 votes of I think 63. It was a huge huge win. So that's the second type, or the third type of the compromise candidate now. Here I have two other plots. We look in the eve of the First World War in 1914. There has been the other Benedict de la Chiesa, and here we have the conflict or the process of three major candidates: Maffei, de la Chiesa, who won, and Serafini. And you see Serafini, that's the blue one. He started very low, but then by and by, he won a lot of votes because he was constructed as an opponent to de la Chiesa. De la Chiesa himself, he started promising, but not too much promising. But nevertheless, he could prevail over Serafini, and Maffei, who started very well, lost confidence because most of his supporters understood that he will not win new votes. And in this moment, they say, okay, that's a lost case. We have to present another candidate against de la Chiesa, but also Serafini did not work very well. And at the end, it was de la Chiesa who was won. The second plot, I have just simply added the votes of the three, of de la Chiesa, of Maffei and Serafini. And I've done a percentage in the first, the second, and so on, up to the 10th ballot. It was a rather long conclave. How much was cumulated on those three candidates? And you see, that's typical for those processes. At the beginning, there is still a very wide field, but then by and by, it increases on the three. Here, there was still some reflection, and they said, we present even another candidate, but it did not work. Okay, let's come to our last point. As I've said, we want to make a choice of some points, challenges of today's papal elections. As I've said, when I wrote this lecture, it was still before the death of Pope Francis and before the conclave. And I said, oh, maybe in the next years we will have a conclave and I will make some contributions. But now it's rather academic. But nevertheless, I have 10 points and 10 challenges of today's papal elections. And I will make some choices and other points will just be mentioned. So the first is very clear: internationalization, enlargement of the Sacred College, and in some cases appointments that have taken place only in recent years. We have seen, we have many freshman cardinals, many cardinals from all over the world, cardinals who did not know each other very well. I'm even not sure how much personally they did know Prevost. It's an interesting point. Of course, they have a first sight idea of him, and he has a huge appeal, he has a spell, he has a very hardly winning personality. But of course, that is something else than knowing somebody over years, working with him together, seeing how he reacts in crisis situations and so on. And that's why I think that's a huge challenge, how we can deal in future with this huge body, very differentiated body of cardinals. But I just mentioned it. And the second point, is, of course, some kind of a continuation of the first point, the increasing number of voters. As you have seen, a long time we had 60 cardinals, more or less. It was also prescribed. And today we have more than the double. And in the time of the 60 voters, it was also that most of them were situated at Rome or in Italy, so they knew each other very well. They were more or less of common culture, common language, and so on. So it was very much like a school class. And today, it's like going to a Luxus liner, and for a certain time, you are together with some people, but you don't know them very well. You know, oh, he likes sherry and he likes mineral water, but you don't know very much more. Of course, it's not so, but I'm sure that also today's cardinals, they look in Wikipedia, who is that provost and what has he done? What nationality is he? At least at the beginning of the pre-conclave. Of course, towards the end, they had surely some understandings. So the third challenge, in previous times, the cardinalate normally was given to a high and important ecclesiastical responsibility, for instance, being Archbishop of Munich, of Cologne, that was an archbishop who is supposed to be a cardinal, or head of a congregation of faith. It's evident he has to be a cardinal. Pope Francis has changed that a little, and he said, no, it's more personal quality. I think it's a little ambivalent because integrating the great power centers, we can say that, like big dioceses and big dicasteries in Rome, is also a contribution to the unity of the church, but also to the reality sense of the church. Because, for instance, being Cardinal of Munich, you have all what can happen in the church and society will be here. So a cardinal of a big diocese will not be a dreamer. The fourth point, that's the question of expanding the electorate after Second Vatican Council. We had sometimes the proposals that, for instance, the heads, the presidents of the bishops' conferences should be integrated in the electoral committee, or even lay people, women today. Also, Pope Francis discussed that, but he did not decide on that. What can we do? What can we say to this point? First of all, I would say never change a winning team. The constitution of the membership of Cardinalate is very well established, and I would not immediately change that very much. I think the order of the day is rather to strengthen the Holy College as a regular, binding and self-confident advisory body, not only in the time of the sede vacante, but also in the time of a reigning pope. Sometimes the cardinals has been put a little aside as an advisory board, and I would like to strengthen that, because today you can govern the church not by your own charisma. You have to have a board of consultants with you, which is confident. And the big strength of the cardinalate today is competence, freedom, and independence of the cardinals. That's very important, also to criticize maybe some not so good ideas of a pope. And especially in the hour of crisis, of a church crisis, for example, when the Holy Father comes under enormous pressure to resign because of misconduct, and is in fact hindered in his performance of office for a longer period of time. That's very realistic in today's media scene. In such a time of a church crisis, a strong collegium of cardinals could help to end the crisis quickly and purposefully. The next point, should membership in the cardinalate and in the electoral college be bound to the priestly and especially episcopal order? Could there also be some integration of lay people, men and women, to the electoral body? Of course, it's not excluded, but I think that would strengthen even more the dissection between potestas ordinis and potestas jurisdictionis. And it would contribute, nolens volens, to a certain kind of secularization of the electoral process. I cannot go into details, but that's why I'm a little skeptical against those proposals. But nevertheless, and that would be my point, this reservation to the episcopal, or at least the priestly order, does not in itself exclude votes of said non-cardinals. For instance, in the pre-conclave, I would formally include also spokespersons from the people of God and from different continents and from different religious orders, because of course they have a very different look on the status ecclesiae, and including that, listening to that, and having a real and effective contribution to the electoral process would be possible without them being, in a formal sense, electors. The seventh point, there is, as we have seen, no formal public or even within the college declared candidacies. The papabili are no candidates in a formal sense. And there's also no open electoral campaign. Succession discussions are also prohibited during the lifetime of a pope. I think in the sense of the unanimitas, that's very important. Nevertheless, I think that we can stress some points, and I'm happy that also Alberto Meloni has stressed a little on that. The first, as Meloni, I would say it seems desirable to slow down the conclaves, not to yield to the pressure looked at on the second day there should be white smoke. For example, in the case of emerging candidates with prospects of success, discussion of persons could be allowed, sensibly excluding the persons concerned. If you look at the duration of the conclaves during centuries, there are enormous fluctuations in the durations of 2 or 3 days, as is now the rule, does not have to be decisive. Why shouldn't such an important decision also take 2 weeks of intensive wrangling? Another point, today we have to look on the biographies of the cardinals and of possible popes. So I would say we need some submission of dossiers in which all voters can present themselves, such as a curriculum vitae, highlighting points of one's own pastoral and theological profile, combined with some meaningful short writings or sermons. Possible weak points, especially stumbling blocks for later attacks and scandals, should also be named. That's very important. The cardinals will be experienced enough to distinguish mere rhetoric from substance in these dossiers, so that you have not only a first sight experience of possible candidates. A somewhat sensitive point is the electoral capitulation. We have seen in history there were this kind of capitulation. I think today it would make sense to have some kind of capitulations in the sense that some voting blocs, conservatives, reform-oriented blocs, say dear new Pope, we would like to give you our votes, but we expect from you this or that. In an informal way, I'm sure exactly that has been done in the pre-conclave of this year's election. They say to him, you have the Pope to have to be the Pope of unity, you have to integrate the different currents of the church. This is some kind of a capitulation, and why not formalize that in a certain sense? Of course, it's theological, a little tricky, but I think it's not excluded. Let's come to a last point. We skip the point 8 and 9. The worst case scenario, the 10th point, and that's my concluding point of the whole conference. The worst case of a papal election, unfortunately, is realistic. It's not only for some nice movies. After the election, there can be some dark points in the biography of the newly elected. And of course, the media, the press, social media, they will find all. And that could trigger years of paralysis of the new Pope. You remember on a rather low level, after the election of Pope Benedict, just in the first days, for instance, the English-speaking press stressed that he has been a Hitlerjunge and a Flakhelper, and so he is an old Nazi. Or afterwards, the crisis about the Holocaust denier Williamson's, the condom statements during the trip to Africa, the embezzlement of letters by the valets, and of course the handling of abuse cases in this diocese. That was some kind of triggering a major crisis, maybe contributed also to his resignation. But what can we do? And I think we should at least consider that for a candidate who is very promising, or even after his election, you have to go very deeply in his dossier, in his biography, in his possible dark points, or for instance, handling of sexual abuse cases in his former diocese and so on. And so, as Meloni said, I would say once he is elected, he should not immediately accept, but there should be some reflection and some going through the dossier, and only afterwards there should be acceptance, or also possible a non-acceptance. Because avoiding a major crisis of the Catholic Church is a very huge value, and it's a value which could justify, let's say, 24 or 48 hours of prolongation of the conclave. But I want to finish my speak, not with this worst case scenario, but with, so now I must see whether this works. You can help. Simply, so, thank you very much.